Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. And the other day I covered on Linny's updated kit, at least based on the official release. And yesterday we just got more information, but this time we have more official info on what all the new weapons will be doing in version 4.0 for the Fontaine patch. So let's start things off, and maybe we'll talk about it for a little bit and see what works and what doesn't. So of course, first of all, we have the new 5-star bow for Linny, the first grade magic. It seems to be like a Staff of Homer stat with a decent base attack and a lot of crit damage. And if we were to look at the passive right here, so damage dealt by charge attacks will be increased by 16%. And every party member that has the same element as the wielder, which counts the wielder themselves, will gain like a gimmick stack, and different will be theatrics. Basically, like the more character of the matching element, the more the attack buff will be given to the user. And if there are more different elements, it'll be more movement speed. So obviously movement speed, nobody cares, it's not even that good. I think I'd much rather run like a Lisa of like Lost Prayers or something like that. But the attack buff, I think with that amount of stat is actually quite significant. In fact, 48% is quite comparable to like a single attack stance. So I guess this bow obviously being, made for Linny, which means you probably want to run a mono pyro Linny. And other teams you could probably include it for like other, let's say charge attack, right? Because the first passive triggers based on charge attack, since it buffs like charge attack damage. So that means like if you were to run Ganyu, you probably have to run like a triple cryo, like maybe Shenhe Ayaka team, which is a little bit weird, but I'm not really sure about that. And other contestants would be someone like Tenari, but I think this bow right now is a bit too niche. To be honest, I think other 5-star bows are going to be decently competitive because the second part of the passive just feels so specific towards a mono elemental team. Unless you're fine with like running 2 of the elements, like because 2 stacks would be like 32%, and this is at refinement 1. So I think this is an okay bow. It's definitely made for Linny or any like kind of charge attack bow DPS character that wants to run like a mono elemental team. But right now I can't really think of anyone aside from maybe like an Amber charge attack hyper carry or like a Linny hyper carry with like a mono pyro and a Kazuha on the team. So overall, I think the new bow is, once again, all the new 5-star weapons that are made for the newer characters tend to be super niche. So I think given how niche it is, I don't think it's going to be worth it. I think, well, the crit damage is pretty good. The first passive is pretty okay, but I think it's very niche. I think there probably are like other options. So this is once again another limited 5-star bow. And then the next weapon that we have is the new fishing bow. Oh god. Does anyone remember farming for R5 catch? Because I still do. So what are the stats? The stats are exactly the same as the catch from Inazuma with a low base attack and a good amount of ER. The passive makes it so that you can, let's see, you gain elemental skill crit rate by default. So it's kind of like Skyward Spine. Well, and no, Skyward Spine is actually more of regular crit rate. So it buffs elemental skill crit rate by a certain amount, and it increases the energy recharge of the character after using an elemental skill. Funny enough, right, the second passive is very reminiscent of the Oathsworn Eye, because the Oathsworn Eye is like the Kokomi look-alike weapon catalyst, where like you basically gain a lot of ER upon using your elemental skill for like a short amount of time. But I think this one is more for Polearm. So I would say this is actually a sword rather than a Polearm, so this is quite interesting. So if we look at the stat, right, obviously you could probably try to run it for your DPS, but I think with this kind of passive, you would want to put this sword on a character that's very energy hungry given the amount of ER that it's able to provide, and a character that maybe does a lot of damage for their elemental skill. So if we look at the list of sword characters, I think there's quite a decent number of characters that can use it. Alhaitham would be interesting, but I think Iron Sting or Tokabo would be decent. And then we have, what do we have? So we have Bennett. I guess if you run like a Bennett or like a DPS Jin, I think, or like a DPS Bennett, my bad, I think it would be decent. Maybe like running it on Xingqiu would also be a good option. And what other options? I think this weapon would be particularly good on someone like Keiya, maybe Ayaka, and probably the best one, maybe like Ayato. Because I feel like Keiya uses his elemental skill a lot, right? And you do need a lot of energy recharge in order to use his elemental burst, which is like the biggest part of Keiya's kit. And the same could be said for maybe like Ayaka. Ayaka is mostly her burst, her skills like every 10 seconds, so it's kind of okay with like the free energy recharge and a bit of crit rate. But I think there are better options like, the craftable Inazuma weapon, the Aminoma Kageuchi. While right now I think this might be the best for Ayato, because a lot of Ayato's damage comes from his elemental skill and his elemental burst, and I believe his burst cost, correct me if I'm wrong, is either 70 or 80, so you do need like quite a hefty amount of ER. So if you use this weapon on your Ayato, that means you can actually buff like your skill damage a little bit by buffing the crit rate, and you do get like a significant amount of ER, so maybe you can justify running an attack stance instead, so I think that'll be pretty decent. As for other candidates, I don't think there's really much. I know I have like Traveler on the list, but I think it's mostly just like a DPS, Bennett, or maybe Ayato. I think that's the best candidate right now, and Alhaitham would be decent. Anyways, moving on to the next weapon. So this weapon is the first installment of the 5 new weapons from the Battle Pass. So we have Scion of the Blazing Sun for the bow. So what's interesting is that this one actually has a higher base attack than most 4 stars right now. This is like the highest number of like base attack compared to like, say maybe the highest would be like Alley Flash, or is it Alley Hunter? Yeah, Alley Flash, the sword. But that is like an exception. So 565 base attack in exchange for a lower crit rate. It seems like the passive, every time a charge attack hits an opponent, it will apply this thing which does like damage scaling based off your attack, and then enemies affected by the thing will take more charge attack damage from the wielder. Now the catch is that this status can only be applied once every 10 seconds, which means this bow, while as good as it is with the stats, with like a lot of charge attack damage against that one single opponent, against like an extra damage every 10 seconds, and it basically buffs charge attack, crit rate, high base attack. The problem is I think this is very single target heavy. So the fact that you cannot reapply the status anyhow you want means it's not going to be good on a lot of characters, other than like maybe in certain situations where you're going against a boss enemy or some sort, because that will be like very high single target damage rather than going against a few mobs, right? So if you look at all the charge attack bow gamers, Ganyu can't really use this unless you're going against a single boss once again. Lini can kind of use this, but I feel like the people who can use this, it really depends on what situation you're into. I think it's decent if you want to use it against like a single enemy, but I think against more than one enemy, that's where it really falls off. So I think it's not really that great. The stats are pretty nice. It's better than nothing. The passive is good, if only the freaking passive doesn't have a cooldown of every 10 seconds, making it purely single target. So the next installment of the Battle Pass weapon, we have the Sacrificial Jade Catalyst. So it seems like this is the deathmatch variant of the new series, where the crit rate is absurdly high, while the base attack is traded in exchange for that being at a low 454. So the passive is actually quite interesting. So if the wielder is not on field for more than 5 seconds, their max HP will be increased by a certain amount, by quite a lot actually. And then Elemental Mastery will be buffed by a very small amount, and the effect will only be cancelled if the wielder has been on the field for 10 seconds. Now, as much as that HP buff might help, you have to consider it from this perspective. Whoever wants to use this catalyst, one, has to be someone who does not scale off attack because the base attack is absurdly low. Number 2, it has to be a DPS catalyst that actually cares about like, you know, like somehow scales of HP or Elemental Mastery, because we have crit rate and the 2 passives are HP and Elemental Mastery. And number 3, it has to be a character that does not stay on field for a very long time. While I would argue that there's a workaround, I think right now we don't really have like a catalyst variant of Yelan, because Yelan scales of HP. I guess we do have Kokomi, but Kokomi has like negative crits, so we're not going to consider that. I guess another option would be like, if you want to run this as an alternate for Kokomi, even though there are like better options like Proto Amber, or you run it for like an on-field Dendro driver Baiju, I think if you run like a DPS Baiju, I think it would be decent. But otherwise, I think right now it's very specific. I think based on our current lineup, there's no real good users for this. However, there's a very high chance that this catalyst will be good for a future character. So I think right now it's not really the best. It doesn't really seem to work with our current lineup, but that might change in the future. So, we may never know, and probably will, to be honest. And then the next installment is the Polearm, Ballad of the Fjords. Once again, regular battle pass stats with crit and the base attack. So the passive, when there is at least 3 different elemental types in your party, Elemental Mastery will be increased by 120. So I don't know the exact situation, like how does the condition trigger? Like when they say 3 different elemental types, do you mean 3 other elements aside from the user, or is there just like 3 different elements overall? Like say maybe I can run like a Hu Tao with a double Hydro Vaporize team with like Xingqiu, Yelan, and then Zhongli. Is that, and then you count Hu Tao. Does it count Hu Tao itself? Does that mean there's like 3 different characters? So we don't really know, but very likely I'm going to assume that it's going to work as such. So this Polearm, I think there's a few users that could use this. Like given that it has low base attack, once again, it has to be a DPS character that doesn't scale as much of attack, and a character that actually is a DPS that scales of crit and they care about Elemental Mastery. So I think there are only like a few options for this case. Like option number 1 obviously be, like I mentioned just now, would be Hu Tao, because Hu Tao, most of her damage basically scales off HP by not really damage, but more of like her damage scales off attack. However, her skill buffs her attack based on how much HP she has. So I think that having the crit rate and the Elemental Mastery for a Vaporized team would be really good. Another option would be Scion. So if you were to use this weapon, and very likely if you're running Scion, you're probably running like an Aggravate with an Anemo character, or you're running like a Scion Quick Bloom or Hyper Bloom or whatnot. So there'll at least be 3 different elemental types, which means you can take advantage of the elemental mastery buff and the crit rate buff. To a certain extent, I feel like it's a combination of the Primordial Jade Spear and the Missive Wind Spear if you don't have that already. And then I would say the last option, obviously the Polearm Icon, the Polearm Archon, the one and only Shangling. But to be fair, like any Polearm in the game is basically good for Shangling. I would say the only restriction that the passive has would be like, it would only work for maybe some sort of Burgeon Shangling or specifically like a Vaporized Shangling, because you want at least 3 different elements in your party to activate the passive. And then now, let's move on to the next one. So we have the Talking Stick. It's a Claymore with once again very high base, very low crit rate. So the passive is quite interesting. You get an attack buff if your wielder is affected by Pyro, and this is once every 12 seconds. And for every other element, obviously aside from Anemo and Geo, you get an elemental damage bonus buff for every single element for 15 seconds. And once again can be triggered every 12 seconds. So why this weapon I think might be the worst for now is because of the condition is so... it's too restrictive. Like realistically, if you think about characters that can kind of use it, maybe a Claymore character like that is affected by Bennett's burst, because any character that stands under Bennett burst will get affected by Pyro, so you get more attack. I guess that's kind of decent. And as for the other one, I guess maybe like if you're using Barbara in your team and then you swap to the Claymore wielder for this weapon and you'll get affected by the wet status, that's technically Hydro. The same could be said for Xingqiu. Cryo, I think right now, the only way you can get affected by Cryo is from Diona's shield upon formation, but it only applies to Diona, so we can't really trigger that. For Electro, I think Beidou, if you guys don't know, when Beidou uses her parry, she gets afflicted by Electro. Like, she has the Electro element on her. So I think this would be decent if you can somehow like run like a hyper carry Beidou of some sort, like use a Bennett buff to trigger the attack buff, and then maybe use Beidou parry to get affected by Electro beforehand. And then you can probably like snapshot the buffs onto her elemental burst. I think it would be decent. While Dendro, there are no characters right now that can reliably apply Dendro. So, well, the only thing that can do that is like the Dendro Samachol, and the only time you see him is like floor 9 or floor 10. So I think this weapon is arguably probably the worst one that we have right now. But I hope that this is a sign that Hoyo will release more characters in the future that will basically act as like cleansers or elemental applicators. We'll have to see for when the time comes. And then for this one's gonna be great. So okay, so the Wolf Fang is the Balpa Sword, regular stats similar as Black Sword. Now the passive is actually pretty good. So it buffs the damage dealt by your elemental skill and burst by this amount, and then every time your skill hits an opponent, its crit rate is increased by this amount, right? And the same applies for the burst. And both these effects last for 10 seconds, and the duration is separate from, skill and burst, and they have maximum of 4 stacks. So which means, right, not only will you get the damage buff for your skill and burst on top of the crit rate statistic that you have on the weapon, your elemental skill and your elemental burst can gain 8% extra crit rate respectively, totaling of up to 35.6, which is basically 36% crit rate. And this is pretty good for any characters, any sword characters that actually does most of the damage with elemental skill and elemental burst. And if we look at the option that we have right now, right, there's actually quite a few. I would say the best candidate for this right now, if I do get him, but maybe we'll have to see, is Alhaitham. Because from what I remember from playing my viewer's account and watching videos about Alhaitham, I think he does most of his damage from his elemental skill and elemental burst, while his normal attacks does like a decent amount, so this is actually perfect if you really want to buff his crit rate by a lot. Plus the first passive buffing the damage dealt by skill and burst increased by a certain amount is pretty damn good. I would say other options would, once again, another one, this would be really good on Ayato if you want to do like a hyper carry Ayato, because most of his damage comes from his elemental skill and elemental burst. It would also be decent for Keqing. Let's see what are the options. Xingqiu would be interesting, but that's if you don't have like, if you already have like enough energy recharge on your Xingqiu before considering like an ER weapon or whatnot. I think this would run well for any sword characters whose damage mostly come from their skill and burst, and yeah, honestly it's great. I think the best candidate right now would probably be Keqing or Hatham. I intend to get this weapon first for 4.0, probably just to put it on my Keqing if I ever need to, but if I can push her to that 100% crit rate and remove the Black Sword from her, I think that would be great. So for the next weapon, we have the Song of Stillness. Now this one is interesting. Once again, this is... Alright, I forgot. We have finished the Battle Pass weapon series, so this one will be the craftable series, which... Okay, you see the note at the bottom? How to obtain Forge. The forging blueprint for the weapon can be purchased from Estelle at Fontaine Smithy. If you guys don't know this, all the other craftable weapons require the billets or the prototype billets from, the one that you can farm from weekly bosses. But from what I'm seeing right now, it seems to be that you can buy the blueprint to unlock it, and then you can probably use like specific materials to make it, maybe just regular rocks, which implies that we probably will not need any new Fontaine billets to craft this thing. I hope so. I hope that is the case, but we'll just have to wait and see. I'll just keep my hopes up for that for now. So looking at the stats, it seems like the stats is the same as the prototype Crescent, and the passive makes it so that the wielder deals more damage if they are healed. This can be triggered when the character is not on field. So if you think about the stats, you want to give it on a character that is like a bow character that mostly scales off attack, where you would put them in a team where they can actually get healed. And after scanning it for a little bit, I think there's only like a few options. Like the first thing I can think of is probably Linny, because Linny, as we have confirmed in the previous video, his elemental skill does heal him. So technically this is, I don't know how much better this is compared to like Proto Crescent, but realistically, as good as Prototype Crescent is, not every enemy will have a weak point, and not everyone will have a good enough skill to hit said weak point consistently to gain the attack buff. So I think this would be a good alternate weapon or alternate bow for someone like Linny. And the other alternative I would say would probably be Fischl. Now, how exactly will Fischl get healing? So if you guys don't know this, there is a team called the Sukokomon or Sucrose Pokemon, which comprises of Fischl, Xiangling, Sucrose, and Kokomi. So if you can probably go look it up. I've done that team in the current Abyss and it can clear just fine. So Kokomi, when she uses her burst right and she hits enemies with like normal attack or charge attacks, she will heal the entire team. And the way Oz works for Fischl is that Oz's Fischl does not, well, Fischl's Oz, I'm done. Fischl's Oz does not snapshot, which means whatever stat that Fischl has currently will affect the amount of damage that Oz is able to do. So the fact that this can be triggered off field means, right, if you run like a team like Sukokomon, or you run a team where Fischl can get healing like off the field, which means that Oz will be able to take advantage of the passive. There are definitely other characters that can take advantage of it, but I'm thinking of like any hyper carry team that uses Bennett, and Bennett only heals you if you are below 70% HP, so I don't think it's gonna be all that interesting. So I think it's very specific, but it would be a good alternate option compared to like Proto Crescent if you can get the passive to work. So for the next craftable weapon, we have Flowing Purity, the Catalyst. It's a high base attack with an attack % buff. Now the passive is interesting. After you use your elemental skill, all your elemental damage bonus will be increased by a certain amount, and it'll form this thing called a Bond of Life, which is worth a quarter of your max HP. So this effect can be triggered every 10 seconds, and after this Bond of Life is cleared, for every 1000 HP that you clear in the process, you'll get elemental damage bonus of up to 12%. And this is up to Refinement 1. So I believe there is an explanation down below, so I can probably show you guys later. But I think this is quite interesting, because this Catalyst wants someone who scales off attack, and it wants like a Catalyst character that actually is like a hyper carry. So if I think of like options, right, I would say it depends on what kind of team you have to run. So let's look at the alternative. Let's say DPS, we have like Klee, Mona, maybe Nahida, Ningguang, Hazel, Wanderer, maybe Yai, Miko, Yanfei. I think it's okay, but I don't think it will be any better than all the other gacha options, such as, the one and only, the 4.5 star Catalyst, the Witsif. But when compared to maybe other free-to-play options, I think it has a place there, but we don't know yet. I think at Refinement 5, if you are able to get it without using billets, would be kind of decent, depending on what team you run that has some sort of healing, but otherwise, I'm not really too sure who this weapon is really for. I think it's a very general weapon, so yeah. So the next one, we have the Polearm, the Rightful Reward. Now this is interesting because it has a high base attack, but the substat is like a HP %. And every time the wielder is healed, it restores 8 HP, and it can only be triggered once every 10 seconds. It can also be triggered while the character is not on field. So my speculation on this Polearm, while the passive is very akin to something like the Kitane Crossspear, the HP substat and the attack substat makes me think that there'll be a new Polearm character in the future whose damage will scale off both HP and attack, which I believe right now, well, technically you can count Hu Tao, but Hu Tao has better options, right? And Hu Tao doesn't exactly scale off HP except for maybe her elemental burst, but most of the attack buff that she gets actually scales more of like the attack that she has. So I think right now there's not really anyone who can really use this weapon, but we'll have to wait until new characters come out. So for the Claymore, we have Tidal Shadow. Once again, a low base attack, high attack percent. When the wielder is healed, the attack will get buffed, and this can be triggered when the character is not on field. Once again, a very specific healing passive, which can be triggered depending on what team you have. So in terms of Claymore characters, I would say, I don't know, like, I guess Beidou, Chongyun. To be honest, I think like any DPS Claymore character can take advantage of this, but the problem is triggering the passive is a little bit hard. I would say like, if this thing was at R5, I assume you will get up to maybe 48% or 36% attack, and combined with this, I think it would be very akin to something like a prototype Crescent, but it depends on how you're going to get that healing. I think a lot of these passives that we've been seeing by far require some sort of healer in your team and requires your wielder to be healed. So like right now, the only off-field healer would probably be like someone like Barbara, Kokomi and all that stuff, but you still need to take damage somehow, so we don't really know. I don't think there's any real good user. I don't think there's any bad user. I think there's just a specific team that you need to run in order to take advantage of the passive. So the next one we have I assume this is the final one, is the Finale of the Deep, the Sword Craftable Weapon. When using an elemental skill, attack will be buffed by a certain amount. It'll trigger the Bond of Life. This time it's actually a quarter of the max HP. And let's see, once it's cleared, you gain a maximum of 150 attack. That is gained based on 2.4% of how much the life bond is cleared. So basically you just gain an extra flat attack. I guess if you can get the maximum, it'll total up to like 715 along with the base attack, but it's mostly just flat attack. I would say at R5, maybe it'll bring it to like 300 or something. I don't know how big the buff is. If we consider 300, that's probably like a few rolls of attack percent, I assume, but that depends on the character. Because I think most characters, at least like 5-star characters, usually have at least like 300 something base attack, right? So right now, the flat attack would basically be, let's see. Okay, if we were to add up the base attack, 565 plus 300 something, let's say we get 900, right? So 150 would basically be like a 24%, 25% worth of attack, but this is at R1. If you can get R5, I think it would be decent. And in terms of the user, once again, you just need a team with healing, and this has to be wielded by a DPS that can benefit from set healing. So to be honest, I don't really know. And then this is the last image explaining how the Bond of Life looks like. Let's read it through together. Bond of Life will absorb the healing effects that a character receives. This will prevent them from recovering HP, and after this character is healed for the amount of the Bond of Life, the bond can be cleared. So it's kind of like a curse. So you don't receive healing because there's something else taking that healing in your stead for you, which is cool. When a character is granted another Bond of Life, the healing required to clear Bond of Life is also stacked. Ah, interesting. It also has a very long duration if not actively cancelled or removed by a statue of 7. So that means you can actually stack the Bond of Life passive based on the weapons multiple times. And what I actually like here, right, if I were to zoom in right now, you guys can see like there's a red bar over there with the status health effect. So it's like, I remember when I saw this like yesterday or this morning, and I thought to myself, why oh why can we not get this kind of status effect for the shields that the character have? Let me just run through it. But like Honkai Star Rail basically has like a small like white outline bar above their health bar. And it looks very similar to Genshin, but you know, it's like basically an outline that shows you like, kind of, you can get a rough idea of how much shield you have remaining. But you know, maybe we'll get in the future. So yeah, this is how the Bond of Life mechanic works. I think it would be quite interesting to see how many weapons will get the new mechanic, and it would be interesting to see what kind of new characters can we get that will provide some sort of like healing or feel of some sort. So I don't really know right now. Anyways, my voice is a little bit hoarse. I can't English. My voice is a bit dry, my throat is dry. That's all the posts that we have today. The video ended up a bit longer than I expected, but that's because I just wanted to go through a full in-depth analysis of every single weapon. If I were to do a summary, Linny's bow is very niche. If you like Linny and you have enough, your wallet is deep enough, you can probably try to pull for it. Or if you think you're lucky, you can probably go ahead, but I don't recommend pulling for the weapon banner because the weapon banner is always a scam. So the free fishing weapon, I think it will be a decent option, like a very decent F2P option, given that, well, you actually kind of have to like fish a lot. I hope it's not going to be as bad as farming for the R5 catch or anything else, because for my experience, the last time I farmed for a fishing weapon, I believe it was the Sumeru one, the end of the line, which was basically a very useless bow. But it only took me like a few days or less than a week to get the R5, so that was pretty good. And if I were to speculate how much you're going to get, very likely there's only two numbers in my mind. The maximum at R5 will probably be like 50% more, or the effects will basically be doubled. So we'll be seeing either 12% elemental skill crit rate with 24% energy recharge, or it's gonna be straight up doubled. So we're gonna get like 16% crit rate and 32% ER, but very likely I think it's the former over the latter. So I mean, those stats are pretty good. You are getting quite a lot of ER for elemental skills, so I'm definitely fishing for this just for an option just to see how good it is. As for the battle pass weapons, very likely, like, based on what I have right now, Claymore is easily, like, the worst because it's too situational. For the Sacrificial Jade, I think, I wouldn't say it's bad, it's just, there's not really any real user right now. I would say the Claymore and the Catalyst are not really that great, and then, what else do we have? I think the Bow would be the third best, but there's a very limited amount of characters that can actually take advantage of the passive, since we only have, we only have, like, so much charge attack bow DPS characters, right? And I would say second best is the Polearm, because you can use it on a few characters like Shengling, Scion, Hu Tao, and you just have to run a team that is full of different elements, at least 3 different elemental types to activate the EM passive. And obviously the first weapon I'm going to get is the Fang, because I'll be leveling this up to max. Maybe I'll make a video about it, how good it is, and test it out with a bunch of different characters. And I'm going to be putting this on my Kaching, because I want more crit rate. And as for the craftable weapons right now, I think I'll leave all the craftable weapons as it is, because I would say like, I do want to craft at least one of it, maybe either the Finale of the Deep, the sword, just to see how the Bond of Life works and just to see how it triggers. But otherwise, I think, so far, I think the Fang from the Battle Pass is probably the best one. The Bond of Life mechanic seems to be quite interesting, but other than that, I think the craftable will have to see what kind of characters that can really take advantage of it. Anyways, I think that's it for the in-depth analysis. Hopefully you guys find this useful, and I will be looking forward to the patch coming up next week. Very likely this is going to be the last video before the patch itself comes live. So I'll see you guys in the next video when I actually try to summon for Lini, and I hope you guys find this useful. And until then, I hope you guys have a good day or wherever you're at, and peace out.